Welcome friends, welcome to our next session that is chapter 3, business object definition and implementation. In this course overview, we will try to understand what are the business objects and how we can implement in the system to use them in the workflow. When it comes to the business object, attributes, events and methods and objects are part of the business object. We'll try to understand one by one in the next slides and understand how we can implement them. The first one is what is object types and how we are going to use them in the workflow. SAP Business Workflow has been developed simulating object-oriented concept. That means most of the workflow concept is based on the object-oriented. It's a OOPS concepts in workflow. Business object types are identified and described with their object methods in the business object repository of the R3 system. So in the workflow, if you look at business objects plays a major role. That's called BOR, business object repository. These are identified and described based on their methods, and the objects you can see events in the BOR. Generally, one object is created in the system and then processed in a workflow over several steps by various employees. What it means is you can create one object and it can be used across the system in one workflow, and this workflow can be used by many people. It's not limited for the one workflow or one person or one process. It depends on how you build your business object, and you can use them in the many workflows or even single workflow for the many people. Object types and objects. Objects are the specific instance of an object type which have been assigned values. So objects is like a specific instance of any object type, and an appropriate object type must be defined before an object is first used. So before using any object, you have to define the object type, and this object refers to the actual thing in SAP. And object types are the abstract and general description of the components of objects. Let's look at some of the example. What are those object types? You can consider in the documents, incoming invoice, purchase requisition, in the master data, customer material master, vendor master, and transactional data. You can consider orders, quotation. It can be anything in SAP. These are some of the examples in the workflows or in the object types. Object types are defined and implemented by specifying their components in the BOR. So in SAP, that's the T code is SW01, where you can check at the business object repository or business objects. In simple terms, we call them as a business object. So in this, business objects are defined by basic data, key fields, methods, attributes, and events. We can check out what are those things. If you see methods is a specific action or steps of a process, and you can pass the parameters. That means it's similar to your function model, where you can import some of the data and do some processing and then export the data using methods. And the attributes are more like object properties, where you can define attributes at the starting level. Whenever you try to execute an object, this attribute properties will be filled in the system and then execute certain values or show some values. And events with parameters. Events is a more common term, but we know any specific action refers to an event. It can be a triggering point or a terminating point. What is the basic motivation behind these business objects? Motivation for the business object is major one is the OOPS concepts, and it wraps around the backend tables and applications and change document and most of the SAP stuff. And business object expose these table fields, application functionalities as attributes, methods, and events. If you look at the diagram on the right side, you can understand the table 1 and table 2 and the SAP application change document and status management all are have been wrapped by business object repository. So that means BOR can utilize all these tables and the attributes and the application and the change document concept, and it can be anything. It's overall in terms it can use the SAP workflow process. Object type definitions. What is the definition of object type? Object types are defined with their methods, attributes, and events in the business object repository. Object methods encapsulates the familiar functions of the R3 system, generally the transactions, and standardize their call. So what it means in an object, you will have certain methods. Each method you can define your own process, or you can use any SAP standard function to define it as a method. To take an example, if you wanted to call any transaction like sales order display or purchase order display, so you can use the transaction and create a method. So whatever the standard transaction have those functionalities, you can just pull out those functionalities into a method. Whenever you execute a method, automatically it calls the specific transaction whatever you define inside. And these attributes describes the properties that an object has. These attributes of these specific methods and our objects defines the properties. It's a type, and objects are the specific instance of an object type at runtime. Each object is referring to a specific instance of the runtime for a specific object type. When you look at the definition in the diagram, object type have interfaces, key fields, attributes, methods, and events. In the attributes, there are three types of attributes. Then is virtual attributes, field references, and object references. In methods, you have synchronous method and asynchronous method, and these methods can use a BAP code, a transaction, or a function module, or a report. If you look at the attributes, there are three types. One is a virtual, field reference, and object reference. Virtual attributes is a combination of fields. Field references, you can directly refer to any existing field in a table field or any other field which is already available in SAP. And object reference, you can refer to another existing business object. That's where you can create an attribute which is referring to another business object. And methods, this is a synchronous and asynchronous method. Synchronous method is like you get the response back to the same method. Asynchronous method is it executes as a parallel activity, and the result can be referred back to the same method, or it can trigger an event. But there are certain processes which you need to follow whenever you wanted to implement an asynchronous method. You can understand more when we go into the next slides. And the ABAP code, transaction, function module, or report. These are the different types of the coding standards you can utilize in these methods. And please note, methods plays an important role in the workflow process. Let's understand what are the key fields. It's a specification of object key, and you can define n number of key fields and referring to an existing application or any field, and client is not needed for these key fields. It's not like a table where you need to define a client, and these key fields you don't need to define client. Attributes is more like database or virtual attributes. The type information from ABAP dictionary field are object type, and you have a different type of attributes that's like single line attributes and multi-line. Single line is like where you wanted to store a single field value, or multi-line is like where you wanted to store values as a table, similar to an internal table concept in the ABAP. Let's understand what is this virtual attributes. As defined or as explained in the previous slides, it's a combination of other attributes or a constant, and explicit you have to define certain implementation process for these virtual attributes. So what it means is, whenever you have a define an attribute for a business object, you wanted to pull some data or keep some data as part of these attributes. How you can pull up, or how you can define some data or some field values in these virtual attributes. You have to implement certain code or certain implementation as part of your business object to fill this data in these attributes. And multi-line attributes, it's similar to internal table. It's correspond to internal table, or almost always a virtual attributes. So that means you have to do a certain implementation to fill up the data in these attributes. It can contain either database field or an object reference. What it means is you can define one field, like take a material number. You define a field as Matner and mark that one as a multi-line attribute. So what business object does is it creates an internal table with a field called Matner, and you can define an object reference, like you take any sales order business object and define that one as a multi-line. So what it does is it creates as an internal table with reference to this business object. Synchronous and asynchronous methods. Synchronous methods results return directly to calling program. This synchronous and asynchronous are similar to what we have in our synchronous and asynchronous function model. Synchronous methods results will be directly returned to the calling program, and asynchronous methods result can only be returned via an event, because you cannot directly return back the result to the same method. So what you have to do is you have to trigger an event. So that becomes a terminating event for this specific method or process in your workflow. And this terminating event must be triggered within the transaction called. The single step task that encapsulates this method requires at least one terminating event. The single step task that encapsulates this method, whenever that means, whenever you define a single step task, that encapsulation happens for this specific method, which is asynchronous, at least one terminating event is required. You can look at the asynchronous methods where you have a method. It can be a dialog method, or the update is how it updates to the database. All methods that write their changes to the database via update task. Synchronization of process is required. And asynchronous method also, there is not much difference. All methods that write their changes to the database via an update task, and synchronization of process is required for the asynchronous methods also. And how to implement asynchronous methods? If you look at the diagram here, you have an option where you can define the field as synchronous method. You can see it here under the general tab, and if you don't tick that mark, then it becomes asynchronous method. So as soon as you create a implementation, what it does is, if you define, it depends on the implementation. Under the ABAP tab, you can see function module, API function, transaction, dialog module, report, and other. If you choose, for example, if you are choosing a transaction where you give the name of the transaction VA03, and as soon as you try to click that, and then it generates a code automatically. Unless if you wanted to choose other and you wanted to write your own coding something, or you wanted to manipulate inside the method. Otherwise it does a job automatically. Let's look at the asynchronous method. In this asynchronous method, when it comes to the implementation of asynchronous method, we don't see much difference, and just a tick mark removal, that's called synchronous. You just need to remove that part, and the remaining is the same. You can choose any of the ABAP type and then try to implement the asynchronous method. I'm trying to show how you can implement that. Events also plays an important role in the workflow. If you wanted to trigger an event, workflow, or if you wanted to terminate an workflow, event is very much important. Let's look at the definition of event. Definition and implementation are two different things in the events. Default parameters need not to be set explicitly. User-defined parameters are set explicitly via container macros, and documentation is indispensable. Interfaces is also part of the business objects. It's a similar concept of OOPS concept. Assurance of a particular behavior, and definition of attributes, methods, and events. Specification of a default implementation, hierarchical structure, replacement of multiple inheritance. Example, if you look at the example, under the document sections, you have financial documents, you have a purchasing document, and you have a sales document. All these financial or purchase or sales documents like BKPF, EKKO, VBAK can be considered as interfaces. Under these interfaces, you will have multiple business objects in the finance side, or purchasing side, or sales side. Another important concept for the object type is release status. So here we have 4 types of release status. One is a model, implemented, released, and absolute. Model is, you cannot, whenever you set any of the object type status as a model, you cannot access them at runtime. And implemented, only in test or internal use purpose we set any of the object type stays as implementer. And released is once you are ready with your object type, and once you've done your modifications or changes or implementation, then you set the status as released. So you can use this business object across the workflow or across the system. And absolute, any of the old business objects you wanted to make them as absolute, we mark them as absolute. Sorry. Let's look at how to implement some of the attributes. You don't see much difference, whenever you try to implement a different type of attributes. That's only, telling the system whether it's a virtual attributes or a database field. So, and then you provide the reference of that particular field and then click OK. So system generates the code automatically, and if you wanted to modify any of the code for these attributes, you can change it. Macros. Macros also plays an important role in the implementation of any methods or attributes. So what exactly or when exactly we are going to use this macros? Whenever you wanted to call the data from the input parameters, or whenever you wanted to set the data back to export parameters of your attributes or your methods, these macros. All these macros from the standard SAP is part of this CNTN01. So you no need to define any of the macros in your own specific, but what you can do is you can use the existing macros. And container for macros, for example, setting up or reading the container elements, the object macros, for example, creating objects or reading attribute values. Object can also be manipulated outside the workflow macros. For object-oriented program like classes or any other methods, you can include this SWF-CNTN01, and this must be used if you wanted to use the macros inside your ABAP programs. Let's look at how to use these macros for the attributes or methods. So to get the access for any of the field property, you can use swc get underscore the property. This is the syntax to get the access, and to call a method, the next one, swc call method, and this is the syntax for that. And to define any of the object, and you can look at the declaration part, and you can look at the creation part, how to create an object using the macros. And container macros. How can you define any of the container macros, or how can you get the value or set the value? So these container macros or these container elements are like method fields. In the method, you define certain import parameters or certain export parameters. These we can call as a container. And even in the workflow also, you can see whatever the fields or new attributes you define in the workflow, that can also be called as a container elements. So in the methods, the method attributes can be a container attribute. So how you can access those one? You can look at these syntax checks, and these checks are very much important in the. This syntax is very much important whenever you wanted to implement any new method. So if you wanted to do any object type reference or object key reference, or if you wanted to refresh any of the object, these are the macros. Here, if you look at on the screen, this is a BOR, business object repository. Transaction code is SW01. You can look at all the business objects available in the system, and whichever is suitable for your workflow definition, you can use that. Delegation. Delegation is another important concept in the business objects. So let's take an example. Most of the cases you try to use a standard business object, but at certain cases you wanted to modify some methods, or you wanted to add your own custom method inside a business object. So how you can achieve that? You wanted to modify a standard business object? No, we're not going to do it. What we will do is we'll copy the standard business object into a Z business object and add our own custom methods, and then we delegate this custom one to a standard one. So what So what happens when you delegate it? So the standard business object, the methods or the attribute properties or event properties will be delegated to the new business object. That's a custom business object. So you always will have a 1:1 reference. So you can define one standard object, or you can delegate one standard object to a one custom object only. You cannot do for the multiple business objects. So you can look at this example how it works. If you look at the SAP standard one, the business object bus 1001, you have only edit and display option. Then you wanted to modify certain things. What happens is you can copy the standard business object and you can add one more method that is called release. And this is a new business object, but when you delegate it, all becomes part of business object 1001. So the properties of standard business object will be delegated to the custom one.